The war effectively began the moment that South Carolina passed the Act of Secession. President-elect Lincoln was committed to the concept that the Union was indivisible, and he was sworn to uphold it. The states that seceded banded together to create the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as its president. The South demanded that the Union remove its forces from government installations in the South. Many Union garrisons surrendered to local forces, but the government refused to agree to the surrender of the others. The most visible government installation was Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. When the government attempted to resupply the fort, the Confederates demanded Fort Sumter surrender. When Major Anderson, the Union commander, refused, Confederates, under General Beauregard, opened fire. In less than 24 hours, Fort Sumter surrendered, and the Civil War had begun. The Confederate States of America, with a population of 9 million, was now at war with the United States of America, with a population of 22 million. The Union, as it became known, produced 90% of the manufactured goods, had 81% of the factories, 75% of the wealth, and 2/3 of the rail mileage. Looking at these figures, the outcome of the war was preordained. Southern leaders, however, counted on 3 factors. First, the power of cotton. 2/3 of the cotton used in Britain was produced in the South. Thus many Southerners counted on foreign intervention on behalf of the South. Second, many Southerners felt that the North would not fight hard for the Union. If there were a few early reversals, they would give up. They did not know Abraham Lincoln. Finally, they relied on the superior military capabilities of Southerners. In fact, the majorities of the graduates from West Point, the U.S. Military Academy, were indeed Southern. After the bombing of Fort Sumter, Lincoln called for raising a volunteer army to put down the revolt. He also announced a blockade of Southern ports. The troops started to arrive in Washington, and the Navy slowly began to blockade Southern ports. The first major battle of the war took place at Bull Run, or Manassas, in July 1861. The Union expected a quick victory on the road to Richmond. Union forces were repulsed and fled back to Washington. The army was re-equipped under the command of General McClellan. It did not move on Richmond until March of 1862, when the Army of the Potomac was transported to the Virginia Peninsula below Richmond. Meanwhile, Union forces in the West had been busy. They had captured the key Confederate forts of Henry and Donelson on the Tennessee River, thus opening both as highways for the North. Memphis was soon taken, and a great battle was fought along the Mississippi at a place called Shiloh. Union forces were victorious, but more Americans fell than had fallen in all previous American wars. Suddenly, the very deadly nature of this war had become clear. Americans were killing Americans in earnest. The Union scored a major victory when naval forces, under the command of Flag Officer David Farragut, captured New Orleans in April. McClellan's attempt to attack Richmond from the rear came to grief when Robert E. Lee became the commander of Confederate forces in Virginia. In a series of battles known as the 7 Days Campaign, McClellan's army was forced into a headlong flight to the safety of Harrison's Landing on the James River. Lee then turned his attentions on the army of John Pope. In a second battle of Manassas, or Bull Run, Union troops were once again beaten. Lee then made one of his most deadly mistakes of the war. Believing that the Union forces were in total disarray, he advanced into Maryland. Union forces were not in the poor condition that Lee had believed. They followed him. And finally, in September of '62, at a small town in Maryland called Sharpsburg, next to the Antietam Creek, the Battle of Antietam was fought. 24,000 Americans were casualties that day near Antietam Creek. more than any other day before or after. Lee was forced to withdraw. After the victory in Antietam, President Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, freeing all slaves in areas yet to be liberated. The year ended with an abortive Union assault on Mary Heights, above Fredericksburg, Virginia, an assault that produced over 10,000 casualties. 1863 started on a positive note for the South when Lee once again outgeneraled his Union opponent at the Battle of Chancellorsville. He once again, however, overextended himself when his army set off for Pennsylvania. For 3 days, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia fought the Army of the Potomac near a small town called Gettysburg. By the end of the 3rd day, Lee's army was decimated. While Lee was losing the Battle of Gettysburg, the only hope the South had on the Mississippi River was lost when Grant accepted the surrender of Vicksburg. While the South might still win some battles, as it did at Chickamauga, it was soon becoming clear that the superior industrial and population might of the North could not be beaten. Southern losses in troops, materials, or even generals were not replaceable. In November 1863, Union troops were victorious in the Battle of Missionary Ridge overlooking Chattanooga. After that victory, Ulysses S. Grant, the commander of Union forces in the West, was elevated to commander of all U.S. forces. He promised President Lincoln a fight to the finish. In May 1864, he moved the Army of the Potomac south to fight Lee. For 40 days, Union and Confederate forces fought, and in the mirror image of McClellan's 7-day battle, where Union forces won every battle but withdrew, here Union forces lost, at least in terms of casualties, each battle, but continued to fight onwards, ever southward. The 40 days ended with Union forces outside Petersburg, while at the same time the forces of General Sherman were encircling Atlanta, after fighting their way there from Chattanooga. Atlanta fell on September 2nd. Meanwhile, the siege of Petersburg continued. No longer was Lee's army mobile. It was now forced to maintain ever-lengthening lines with even fewer men. The South was helpless to stop General Sherman's cross against Georgia from Atlanta to Savannah and then north through South Carolina, a march that destroyed almost all in its path. Finally, on April 2nd, the Confederate lines in Petersburg collapsed. Both Petersburg and Richmond fell to Union forces. Lee fled with his small army westward, but was soon surrounded and on April 9th surrendered, thus effectively ending the war. One final sad chapter was played out when President Lincoln was assassinated on April 15th by Booth.